Now we are on step 3 of 4. We're going to compute the cost per equivalent unit of production. That means we had to fill out this section in the red box. Up to this point in steps 1 and 2, we focused on the units, which are the actual puzzles the cutting department made. But now we turn our attention to the costs associated with those puzzles. Let's start with the beginning work-in-process costs. Remember, these units were the partially complete units at the end of the last period. So they become this period's partially complete units at the beginning of this period. As such, these partially complete units have costs transferred in from the previous process, which we get from the data table. So these units had $22,000 of transferred in costs from the previous department. Now we move on to the direct materials costs of these unfinished units, which we get from the data table. Notice the costs are 0 for direct materials. That makes sense for this process because these are unfinished units in beginning work in process at the beginning of the period. And this cutting department adds direct material costs, which is the box for the puzzles, only when the puzzles are 100% complete. In other words, at the end of the process. And since these puzzles are unfinished, they have not been put in the box and therefore do not have any direct materials costs. Next are the conversion costs, which we also get from the data table. Then for total cost for beginning work in process, we just add $22,000 plus $0 plus $1,200 to get a total of $23,200. These are the costs associated with the partially complete puzzles in this process at the beginning of the period. Now we move on to the costs added during the period. So the first thing we need are the costs transferred in from the previous process. For that, let's look at the screenshot of our T accounts. Remember, we are now working on the cutting department. So what were the costs of the 40,000 units transferred out of the assembly department and into this, the cutting department? The costs were $176,000. Now we move on to the direct materials added during July. According to the data table, $19,000 of crayon boxes were added to the cutting process in July. Now we move on to the conversion costs added during July. According to the data table, $14,840 of direct labor and manufacturing overhead were added to the cutting process in July. So this gives us a total of $209,840 of costs added during the period in the form of transferred in costs, direct material costs, and conversion costs. Next, we'll complete the transferred in column. Adding $22,000 and $176,000, we get total transferred in costs of $198,000. Next, we divide by total equivalent units of production, which we get from up above in the units section of the report. The next step is to simply do the math. $198,000 of transferred in costs to account for, divided by 45,000 total equivalent units gives us $4.40 transferred in costs per puzzle. Next, we'll complete the direct materials column. Adding $0 and $19,000, we get total direct materials costs of $19,000. Next, we divide by total equivalent units of production, which we get from up above in the units section of the report. The next step is to simply do the math. The cost per equivalent unit of production for direct materials is total direct materials costs divided by equivalent units of production for direct materials. So $19,000 of direct materials costs to account for, divided by 38,000 total equivalent units gives us 50 cents of direct material costs per puzzle. Next, we'll complete the conversion costs column. Adding $1,200 and $14,840, we get total conversion costs of $16,040. Next, we divide by total equivalent units of production, which we get from up above in the units section of the report. The next step is simply do the math. The cost per equivalent unit of production for conversion costs is total conversion costs divided by equivalent units of production for conversion costs. $16,040 of conversion costs to account for divided by 40,100 total equivalent units gives us 40 cents of direct materials costs per puzzle. The last part of this third step is to complete the total costs column. For total costs to account for, you can either add them from left to right or add vertically by adding beginning work in process total costs and add that to the total costs added during the period to get $233,040 of total costs to account for. Then the final part of this step 3 is to calculate the total cost per equivalent unit, which adds $4.40 and 50 cents and 40 cents to get $5.30 of product costs per equivalent unit.